Okay, great. So everybody, welcome to our panel of pandemic immobilities. Um, we're going to go ahead and get started. Our first speaker today is Amson Hagen. Amson is from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he is going to give us a talk on enduring temporalities of material non-movement, waithood and waiting for COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. Okay, go ahead, Amson.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's definitely this is like a really short, rough draft of something I've been thinking about for at least the past year. And um, I participated in the workshop yesterday. There was a workshop, and so I've got a lot of feedback. So for those of you who haven't heard of this sort of topic, I'm interested in what you all think about it. So it starts off with the notion of materials moving into and out of Africa more easily than people fails to accurately capture this current moment of COVID-19 vaccination, manufacturing, and distribution that we're in right now. And so as Western nations or the West develop, manufacture, and continue to purchase vaccines and also send them around amongst themselves, uh, many African nations and poor nations around the world are forced to wait their turn, only acquiring vaccines via humanitarian donations or from the WHO COVAX program, um, or from Western nations who are willing to gift meager amounts to the World Health Organization and several other countries. For example, the Netherlands just recently did this. In fact, WHO estimates that vaccines will be globally accessible sometime in 2023, so a full 2 years from now, and a full 2 years after many Western nations will have had them to vaccinate their populations. So despite globalized rhetoric around the pandemic in which the entire world is affected, this problem's globalized while the solution, vaccines, for example, is materially isolated to the West and in the West. And relying on readings of news reports from around the world, including Africa, I'm trying to tease out some of the ways in which socio-historical forces dictate that Africa is essentially meant to wait to receive anything, including COVID vaccines, because the West suffers from that same malaise, but Africa can't be the first or even at the same time as Western nations. Africa and African peoples continue to exist in negative and deadly relation to the West on a predetermined temporal axis, where they're existentially and materially waiting on the West. So again, the West is first and Africa and the rest are last. Movement of vaccines to and throughout Africa is a demonstration of this, temporally bound rather than spatially constructed. So geography isn't actually an issue. It's mostly like willpower and this idea of being relegated to the behind or the after for Africa. This echoes a much broader condition of waiting and waithood. It's been instituted and maintained by neoliberal capitalism and also sort of racial antagonism and sort of the afterlives of colonialism and imperialism. So the vaccine is available. I mean, I've been reading news reports for the past few days about many countries getting their first doses of the vaccine, but unfortunately it's not available to everyone equitably. And so this idea of availability has a nuanced meaning in the era of this COVID-19 vaccine. Again, the vaccine's available, but only to some and in certain places, and additionally, not to everyone or everywhere. So pharmaceutical giants, including Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, have created their first vaccine doses or vaccine products to hit the market. And again, recently, I think there were past few days, a few other pharmaceutical firms have come out with new vaccines touting like 95.6% efficacy, right? News reports abound about America and various European countries buying up global supply of vaccines and hoarding them while um, and those news reports have been around since again the um, initial distribution of vaccines in January 2021. So this idea of waithood and temporality is really interesting to me. And waithood's colonial and racial dimensions animate the social, economic, and political phenomenon of waiting. Thus, this construction of waithood allows it to contribute to the neoliberal flattening of historical and racial phenomena as class-based results of economic impotence of African leaders and countries. So in other words, it's because of the feeble power and profligacy of African markets and also their governments that many of these African nations remain poor since the sort of end of de jure colonialism, and thus must wait for the West to grant them access to COVID-19 vaccines. Um, I think as COVID's ravaged across national borders throughout the world since late late February, early March 2020, um, governments have started to confront this issue as a true pandemic. Um, Not all governments in the same way, but for the most part, most. Um, and they've also considered a biological and an economic catastrophe of global consequence. So task forces were mobilized across borders in the US, but definitely, for example, throughout West Africa and the Sahel, there have been several task forces that have been put together to share resources between and among African nations, and also to help take advantage of existing sort of in pharmaceutical capacity of certain countries like Nigeria, for example. And even the idea of closing borders has been done in conjunction with other countries. So, for instance, Niger closing its border was part of a relationship that it shares with Mali, for example. So we have a lot of that, but that's still sort of speaking to this idea of a pandemic and everyone needs to work together, right? Um, to that end, response times of nations in terms of creating COVID-19 testing, quarantining, public health plans, those all existed, but they existed differently across the globe, right? We have China and New Zealand acting with a sense of urgency, but then we have the US struggling for the first few months of the pandemic throughout 2020. And so, I'm speaking again. Meanwhile, other states repeatedly skirted the US's Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. Advice refused to close borders, or were still allowing international travel. They rushed to reopen businesses. The US has sort of fluctuated with that particular idea for the past year. Reopening venues and restaurants and trying to get students back into school buildings. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said last year, it's not that serious, it's just the flu. And this sort of characterizes a lot of um, some Western countries' sort of responses to the pandemic, at least from their governments. And so we have this in conjunction with, or if you contrast this with how many African nations, Niger and, for example, Nigeria and a few other places, closing their borders, or like Kenya, who's had a curfew for pretty much like a workday curfew for almost the past 12 months. So a lot of countries in Africa have taken this quite seriously, and one would, I think, be right to sort of venture out that these have affected or influenced their relatively low COVID-19 infection rates and also low death rates from COVID-19. However, it's the West that has been able to manufacture, produce, and also like corral the vaccine market, whereas all of these other nations are sort of left behind waiting, even though, again, with the notion of a pandemic, everyone is sort of everyone's exposed to the same dangers, right? So I'm skipping ahead here because I did not cut down this paper for a talk, still in draft mode. And so um, there has been, we have Operation Warp Speed that took place in the US, the US government sort of touting its ability to combat the pandemic and its ability to take care of its citizens, right? And so in early summer 2020, many Western news outlets wondered aloud about these low COVID-19 infection and mortality rates throughout the African continent, promptly prompting concerns and hopes that Africa and Africans were not on the timeline and possessed some secret to having a low virus susceptibility rate that the West could take advantage of. Right, and scientists, there are a couple of French scientists who were speaking to, I think, Radio France. I don't. There was a Reuters article about this, and this had been covered a lot extensively in social media. These two scientists were on a French radio station. They wondered aloud about these low African sort of COVID-19 infection rates, and one of them prompted. Again, why Africa and how is a sort of common refrain. And there's this idea of lessons learned, for the West to take from Africa. In this sense, it responsibilizes African nations, scientists, and peoples to care for the rest of the world, which is not unlike what we've seen from colonialism, which is, in a sense, in places like Niger, gained independence from France in 1960. And so it's not that old, not that long ago, this idea of Africa having to care for other people around the world and the West. And so, again, under emergency, the ill effects of disaster are unevenly distributed across peoples and places, but also across time. So even as the summer arrived and COVID-19 cases and deaths increased from Senegal to South Africa, the Western reaction to Africa is quote unquote different from the rest of the world. Was further solidified as social fact when Western scientists are looking at statistics, right? And so there was, I think I misplaced this quote, but there were two French scientists who wondered aloud about testing. This is in, I think, May or June of last year, wondering aloud about testing different drugs on African peoples. So the idea that there was talk about using malarial treatments or prophylaxis to treat or to prevent COVID-19 infection. And so this idea of Africa as a laboratory definitely echoes a lot of colonial, not imaginaries, but colonial traumas and memories from the not so recent past. So I'll end here with, we've seen this before. So Africa has always been and remains outside the historical and political container that is, quote unquote, the West. The momentary global fixation on Africa as a harbor for Western material and metaphysical benefit in the form of COVID-19 clues, right, is a continuation of the colonial and racial violence that originally positioned Africa as outside the pale of the West, outside of civilization and the normative human being. And so, again, this last minute, what I really wanted to do with this is sort of try and trace some historical connections between this sort of COVID-19 pandemic and response and to past infection control efforts around the world and involving Africa in a particular way. So I focus on the Belgian Congo as a laboratory. So in 1957, the live attenuated oral polio vaccine developed by Hilary Kaprowski was administered throughout the Belgian colonies, which include Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. And even though the vaccine trials vaccinated more than 1 million people in the colonies, right? The goal was not to vaccinate them, but it was to test the efficacy of the oral polio vaccine so that it could be approved for use and distribution in the US, right? So in terms of trying to secure a market, colonial peoples, African peoples are not necessarily a market that Kaprowski or the people, the organizations supporting the creation of the vaccine cared about. They wanted access to the West. And Jonas Salk had already produced a vaccine that had been used, that had already been in use in the US. So Kaprowski needed to make a new one that was different than the Salk vaccine. And he needed a quote unquote viable laboratory, and that ended up being the colonial Belgian Congo. So I think I'm out of time. Is that right? Yes? Euler?
30 seconds.
Okay, well, I'll stop here. I know I kind of peregrinated around for a little bit, but I was sort of trying to trace what we'd seen in the Belgian Congo to now. And later on in this paper, I hope to get into individual sort of national responses to not necessarily to the vaccine, but to COVID-19, how countries have prepared for it, including, for example, I mentioned Kenya and Niger. And then also, I've been on Twitter a lot, and there are interesting responses that I've received and encountered with, for example, Kenyans who necessarily were not interested in the vaccine, particularly because one of the reasons they cited was because Europeans weren't taking the vaccine themselves. There's a lot of white European hesitancy, and we're also seeing that a lot in the US. And so the response that I've gotten from people in Kenya anyway has been, why would we take the vaccine when they don't want it, right? So hopefully this paper, I can make time to go into that later, but thank you for listening.
Yeah, on that note, thank you, Amson. We're going to actually save the questions until the end, until everyone has spoken. So if you could write down your questions and save them, we will get to you after our last speaker has given his talk. So we're going to go next to Kristen McLean from the College of Charleston. She will be talking about exploring mobility and movement in pandemic times, the case of Sierra Leone. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. So I actually, the order of events here, I think work quite well in the sense that I do think my piece speaks kind of really nicely with Amson's in the sense that I actually am engaging with this concept of waiting and waithood as well, but less from the perspective of collective health security and more with attention to individual health security. So I think that in dialogue that they'll actually work quite well. I did want to point out too, one of my students, Sydney Island, is in the audience. She's been assisting me with the research that I am going to be presenting today. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. I have a few slides. Let's see. Can everyone see okay? Good. Although I realize if I do that, then I can't see my notes. I haven't had to do this before where I have to see my notes and the pictures at the same time.
You can try loading on your phone or something.
Yeah.
If your phone has a PowerPoint.
That might take too
In
long.
the same boat, yeah.
Or just go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead. Sorry about that.
The picture looks fine, actually, even when it's a little bit smaller.
Okay, so I'll just talk. Sorry, I won't use the photos. You'd think by now I would have figured this out, seeing that I use Zoom literally every day. Okay. On November 28th of last year, I received a number of WhatsApp messages from an unknown number. They informed me that my friend Tamba, a pseudonym, a friend from my time in Sierra Leone, had been beaten severely, nearly to the point of death, by immigration officers. He was living in the Gambia at the time, where he had moved back in 2018 with the hopes of migrating to Europe. Since the early 2000s, the tiny West African nation has become a popular transit country for irregular migrants from sub-Saharan Africa en route to Europe by crossing the Mediterranean. When I finally spoke with Tamba himself a few days later, he explained what happened in more detail. I was going home at around 9:30 at night, he told me, and I met this guy standing by the roadside. He was an immigration officer, but he wasn't in uniform. He stopped me and asked me about my 2020 residential permit. And I told him I don't have 2020 because of coronavirus, but I have my 2019 permit. He then said that I should give him something like 1,000 dalasi, which is about 25 US dollars. I told him I don't have the money, and he said he would have to arrest me. We were standing there until the immigration truck arrived. A lot of Sierra Leoneans, young boys, and other foreigners were on board in that pickup. On our way going, they were taking money from the others and letting them go. But the only money I had was just like 50 dalasi, which was something like $2. I started begging them, but they refused the money. The vehicle was about to enter the station, and I knew if we got there, it would mean more money. So I got down from the truck. It was then that one of the immigration guys saw me and just rushed at me and started beating me seriously. They beat me mercilessly. I even peed on my trousers. After beating me, they took me behind the station and left me by the toilets. They left me there for hours in the cold weather, unconscious. Well, I was, of course, horrified by the story. I also couldn't help but think how Tamba's life, since I had known him, had been defined by what seemed like an endless series of unfortunate events. Tamba left Sierra Leone shortly after the most recent presidential election, which brought in a new government under the leadership of President Julius Maada Bio. With the goal of reducing what he saw as corruption within the former administration, one of the first things Maada Bio did was to cancel or suspend the licenses of several big mining companies. As a result, over the last 2 years, mining export revenue has fallen by about 50%. And for a country that is dependent on mining exports for over 60% of its GDP, this situation has been catastrophic. For Tamba, these events had a direct impact on his life and livelihood. For prior to Maada Bio's election, he had been working as a drill rig operator for a local diamond mining company. When it closed, Tamba explained, it was really difficult for the young men like us to survive, to get a job. Unable to find another source of employment, he decided to leave for the Gambia with high hopes of migrating to Europe from there, as friends of his had done before him using what he calls the back way. After a 4-day journey by car, he arrived and quickly set to work seeking out construction jobs and other ad hoc employment opportunities to earn the money he would need for his trip to Europe. As a foreigner in the Gambia, he was not allowed to work for commercial companies or engage in machine operating as he was skilled to do. Other well-paying jobs, he complained, would go to the Gambians, not foreigners, even if they were less qualified. So he resigned himself to hard labor, grateful to have the opportunity to earn something. Then in late March 2020, a novel respiratory disease, now known as COVID-19, of course, arrived in the region. Prior to the pandemic, Tamba had described his situation in the Gambia as difficult. But when the pandemic started, he told me things were worse than before. All those areas where we used to go work and find construction jobs, everything just stopped. They closed everything. There was no movement. And you have to pay house rent, you have to eat. So it was really tedious for us. It was after the arrest and beating by the immigration officers that Tamba decided it was time to return back to Sierra Leone. In the context of the pandemic, he no longer saw a viable path forward to Europe, as his method of earning funds for the trip had been compromised. As he emphasized, you have to move to get money, not to mention the fact that many of the boats had been seized. Because of this corona, he explained, you cannot cross the border. All the borders were closed, so you couldn't go anywhere. Even up until now, the border from the Gambia to Guinea is closed. This, of course, presented Tamba with another challenge. How is he going to get back to Sierra Leone if the borders were closed? The less expensive way out by vehicle, as he had come in, was through smuggling, but that is a lot of constraints, he explained. You have to travel at night, soldiers will be there. So he would have to travel by plane. But a ticket from the Gambia to Sierra Leone was costly, at least $300 for the hour-plus flight. Fortunately, after several months of asking friends and acquaintances for support, he was able to gather sufficient funds to make the trip. However, upon landing in Sierra Leone, the little money that he had on him, he was required to use towards an $80 COVID test to gain entry to the country. Ashamed by the prospect of arriving to his family completely empty-handed, a burden rather than a blessing, He continued on to Liberia, where he's been residing with a friend since. The social and economic challenges faced by Tamba are certainly not unique, but are experienced in some way or another by the vast majority of Sierra Leoneans. Between 2014 and 2016, as part of my dissertation research, I sought to better understand the relationship between historical and political economic forces and men's notions of masculinity in Eastern Sierra Leone. In this context, while gender roles are certainly shifting in light of contemporary trends, a man's capacity to be a good husband and father is still very much measured by his breadwinning status. However, as an economic crisis propelled by the country's decade-long civil war during the 90s and failed neoliberal economic reforms has made it exceedingly difficult for young men to afford to marry and establish households, key markers of social adulthood. The term youth men has emerged to describe men living in this liminal position, those who have failed to attain adulthood despite their biological age. There is now a whole genre of youth studies that refer to young African men as either stuck or sitting, killing time, or waiting for adulthood. This feeling of being stuck in the metaphorical sense has only been exacerbated by recent disease outbreaks, which have compounded men's immobility in a very physical way. During the West African Ebola epidemic of 2014-2016, novel public health containment measures constrained men's movement and personal freedoms as they had never before experienced. For the first time in their lives, men found themselves confined at home, often under the threat of military force or financial sanctions, separated from loved ones, and physically prevented from engaging in income-generating activities. During the height of the crisis, provisioning became a severe challenge, threatening their very survival in addition to their identity as men. It is perhaps not surprising to learn that many breached quarantine protocols. In Sierra Leone, gender roles allocate certain freedoms to men, and one of those freedoms is that they are guaranteed a certain amount of mobility. They go out of the house, whereas women are expected to stay in. Part of the reason they're allotted this freedom of movement is, of course, because they're expected to go in search of daily chop money or food money. Men are thus understandably shaken and irritated by their sudden immobility, some remarking that they found the seizure of their freedom to be even worse than the threat of Ebola itself. As one man lamented, during the Ebola period, we were just stuck. You just stay in one place. You do not go either this way or that. Nobody moves. To always stay in one place like statues is very bad. It wasn't until more recently, of course, that I developed my own real understanding of what that might feel like. Then just 3 years later, on January 30th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the outbreak of COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. By March 2020, exactly 1 year ago, it was formally declared a pandemic. In response to a much criticized, sluggish response to the Ebola outbreak, the government of Sierra Leone acted quickly to institute even more severe containment measures in the spirit of never again. The country closed its borders and greatly restricted movements between its 14 districts. In light of immediate consequences, for instance, in terms of interrupting business and in response to rapidly growing food security, these restrictions were eventually eased. But just last month, actually the end of January 25th, in response to a new wave of coronavirus infections, the government imposed yet another round of lockdowns and imposed a nightly curfew for all citizens. People again complained of feeling stuck and worried about their survival. The international support that had come during the Ebola outbreak did not materialize because, as one of my friends explained in reference to the US and Europe, they too are suffering the same calamity, even above Africa. While on one hand, the country should be commended for the seriousness with which it has approached the pandemic, it is also important to consider how pandemics and their responses are, as Melissa Leach writes, social and political phenomenon that involve much more than disease. Similar to Tamba, many of my friends still living in Sierra Leone described these new containment measures as creating suffering and hardship that went well beyond that which they had experienced during the Ebola crisis. Clearly, public health measures implemented in the face of Ebola and now COVID-19 constrained men's physical and social mobility. These circumstances necessitate a discussion of the age-old debate within public health regarding the relative importance of collective versus individual health security, in addition to the ethics of quarantine and other containment measures. First, I witnessed in the context of the West African Ebola outbreak, and I'm witnessing now in response to COVID, both in Africa, but mainly here in the US, my own experience, protective measures intended for the public good they also come with very real personal costs to one's livelihood, to one's social relationships, to an overall feeling of not being able to move forward with one's life, as I'm sure we're all sort of familiar with. So any discussions of pandemic response should also be framed in light of a country's specific context and history. As Paul Richards writes with respect to Sierra Leone, we need to understand the country as a product of the emergence of the globalized economy based on the slave trade and its aftermath. For COVID has linked itself to legacies of injustice and inequality associated with Atlantic commerce, which is now borne out in terms of who is allowed to move and who must stay put, who gets to cross borders and who doesn't. It's this very history that has set the stage for an economic crisis that caused Tamba to leave his home in Sierra Leone in the first place, despite the risks involved, which he was very aware of. As he explained to me, it's better to be in prison over there in Europe than to be here. There you are free. In Africa, everything is hard, even if you are hardworking. For Tamba, the economic pressures he felt at home in Sierra Leone were many. His father is deceased, so he is the eldest son, is left to care for his mother and his 3 younger siblings. He also has a daughter of his own. But now he is stuck in limbo, unable to go on to Europe, yet not able to face his family in Sierra Leone either. As he explained to me, when you leave with the hope to go find something. Just imagine, you leave, you go for 3 years, you leave your country, you leave your family. Then after all I went through, I still have nothing. If I'm thinking of coming back, how will I even start? If my daughter sees me, what will I do? They are expecting from me. So just imagine, you feel shame. By emphasizing the structural forces constraining Tamba's life choices, and particularly his ability to move freely, I don't mean to suggest he lacks personal agency. In fact, African conceptualizations of waiting or waithood do convey a certain dynamism. As Alcinda Nwana argues, African youth in waithood are not inactively lingering, but use their agency and creativity to invent new forms of being. And I should emphasize here that Tamba did find his way out of the Gambia to Sierra Leone via what he described was a combination of faith in God, a deep social network, and pure grit and determination. That said, his story begs the question of whether containment measures in this region are appropriately tailored to people's lived realities. As Melissa Leach and colleagues write, labor migrants and other people whose daily provisioning depends on multiple overlapping living and household arrangements are hugely affected by top-down measures that do not take into account diverse livelihoods and lifestyles with different notions of home and different requirements of movement. This is reflective of the blindness to inequality and social difference, much of technocratic development, well beyond edicts on pandemic health measures. With respect to COVID in Sierra Leone, there have been some scholarly debate over how effective containment measures have actually been in containing the virus. Undoubtedly, early on, lockdowns helped to slow the spread of the virus. And while cases did accumulate in the capital, Freetown, early on, the disease didn't actually advance through the rest of the country to the level that some had anticipated. Some point to the extent to which Sierra Leoneans live their lives outdoors, where the virus is less likely to transmit, as one potential explanation. Others note that indoor factories and care homes for the elderly, which are major sources of infection in Europe and North America, as we know, are uncommon in many African contexts. So warranted is this question of whether the punishment fits the crime, right? Are highly restrictive top-down government measures needed in this context, or perhaps do they do more harm than good? As Leach and colleagues argue, inequalities are revealed not only in relation to disease burdens, but also in how people are affected by disease control efforts. Epidemics are often said to be mirrors of society, and COVID-19 has revealed a highly unequal world. It has highlighted inequalities and structural vulnerabilities, often the result of long histories of marginalization. And as demonstrated in Tamba's case, the state-mandated control measures put in place to date have significantly affected individuals and the informal economies upon which they depend, rendering them largely invisible, and their suffering uncounted by traditional epidemiological measures. While there are understandably heightened fears about the potential for uncontrolled COVID-19 transmission, both in the region and more broadly, it's imperative that control measures do not replicate larger biases in society in favor of globally standardized interventions. Needed instead are less restrictive measures that are more attuned to community needs, which was a key lesson learned during the Ebola epidemic, and that reflect deeper understandings of local agency and mobilization. And as Leach writes, all the attendant complexities, contingencies, and uncertainties of particular contexts, histories, and ecologies. So I'm going to stop there, but I might just, do I have time to just briefly run through my slides?
Sure, you can take another 30 seconds to run through.
30 seconds, okay.
Yeah, pretty fast.
Okay. Okay, so this is Tamba. He sent me photos of his, the aftermath of the run-in with immigration officers. And then he was very proud of his plane ticket. It was the first time that he had flown, but he was also very much shocked by the charges that were going to be included with regards to COVID tests. There were $20 US leaving the Gambia and 80 upon landing. This is where I work in Sierra Leone in the east. It's a mining region of the country, mostly diamond mining, and as such, it was experienced the brunt of the violence during the Civil War as the different factions were fighting over control of the mines. These are some pictures from the Ebola outbreak. I was in Sierra Leone during much of it. During COVID, of course, I haven't traveled, but the response was very militarized. So people really felt, like they were literally stuck within their homes. Markets closed, of course. This is a document that lists the fees or the fines for COVID-19, $500,000 fees for non-use of face mask in public or lack of washing hands in public. That's about $50 US, so really steep fines. And this last photo is just a friend's rice harvest that's spoiled in his farm because of lockdowns between distant districts he wasn't able to get from the city to his rural farm. There's a lot of, as many of you I'm sure are aware, migration within the country between urban and rural areas. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kristen. As we had mentioned before, for people who are coming in and out, we're going to be saving questions until the end. So if you have questions for Kristen, please hold on to them, and we'll get to them at the end. Our next speaker is Francis Musoni. He is from the University of Kentucky, and today he will talk to us about the COVID-19 pandemic and the history of illegalized mobilities across the Zimbabwe-South African border. Thank you, Francis.
Okay, thank you so much for the introductions. And I am going to try to share my screen as and go over my presentation with a few slides that I want to show. So my presentation really is an attempt to inject some historical thinking into ongoing discussions about COVID-19 and its impact on mobility in Southern Africa. And I do this by focusing on the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, which has been in the news over the past few months owing to the border control crisis or chaos that became so visible as these countries tried to restrict people's movements in light of the pandemic. So as was the case in many parts of the world, the Bedbridge border post between South Africa and Zimbabwe was closed to non-essential traffic in March 2020, following, of course, the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. And when the border reopened in mid-December 2020, there was chaos at the border, at the port of entry between these two countries, as thousands of South Africa-based Zimbabweans took the opportunity to visit their country of origin. So what you see on this slide is a very long queue of vehicles waiting to be cleared on the South African side of the border so they could cross into Zimbabwe. This pileup began a few days before Christmas, as thousands of people returned home for the holidays. Some of the reports that I've seen allege that at some point, the queue actually stretched for more than 15 kilometers. And that some people who waited at the border for at least for actually up to 5 days waiting to be cleared. I've also seen reports suggesting that at least 15 people died while waiting in this queue. However, I must say that I've not been able to verify some of these reports as factually correct. But just after the New Year's, we saw a similar scenario as vehicles piled up again, initially on the Zimbabwean side of the border, but eventually on the South African side as well. And inevitably, some of the affected people resorted to crossing and using unofficial channels, leading to the arrest and deportations of hundreds of them, as you can see on the picture on the bottom of my the bottom slide. So in an attempt to manage the chaos, the South African Minister of Home Affairs visited the border area and gave a statement in which he said illegal crossings of the border undermined his country's sovereignty. And the minister then went ahead to promise deployment of the police boats on the Limpopo River and armed helicopters to patrol the border. The Limpopo River is the river that runs between the two countries. So as the region sought to understand these developments, it was common I noticed that most of the scholars, policymakers, journalists, and other people who commented on this issue, blamed three major factors, or they cited three major, factors that they saw as the problem that was causing this. The first is the ongoing economic crisis in Zimbabwe that has generated high levels of unemployment and general conditions of poverty and insecurity in that country since the late 1990s. The second is what some people saw or see as the failure of South Africa's post-apartheid government to secure the country's borders. Some also blamed the two countries' poorly managed efforts to contain the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic through extra screenings requirement that drastically slowed down traffic at the border. So although I do not doubt that these factors contributed to the most recent chaos at the Bedbridge border post, I was a little concerned by the absence of historical reflections in this discussion. So I thought that it might be interesting to see what these developments reveal about the historical contestations over the meaning of this border and movements across it. So to better explore this question, I would like to talk about a few moments from the past when the same border has been at the center of similar chaos and contestations. And I explore some of these issues that I'm going to talk about in my book, which was published in April last year, you would say in the height of the pandemic. So first, I'm going to talk about what happened soon after the inception of this border as a colonial boundary in the late 19th century. So like most interstate boundaries in Africa, the Zimbabwe-South Africa border was born out of the European colonization of the continent in the late 19th century. So in this case, it was the British occupation of the Zimbabwean plateau in 1890 and the subsequent rise of the country that they named Southern Rhodesia, which reconfigured what previously was an ordinary river, the Limpopo, running across the Venda territory, as you can see on this slide. The entire border between the two countries is made up of, there's a river that runs between these two countries. That's the Limpopo River. So the colonization of the Zimbabwean plateau reconfigured the Limpopo into a juridical divide between the two countries. So by 1900, the Southern Rhodesian administration had introduced various measures to restrict the movement of people across the Limpopo, such as requiring labor agents wishing to recruit workers from the colony for employment in the Transvaal, which is northern South Africa, to pay much more in registration and license fees than those who were recruiting for local employment. And occasionally, the authorities also deployed the police to arrest recruiters operating in the border region without the necessary permits. So given that the conquest of the Zimbabwean plateau came at the backdrop of centuries of cross-Limpopo mobility, the Venda people and other communities in the border region devised various methods and means to continue moving back and forth across the river. And this gave rise to what I refer to as border jumping, but which is often referred to as illegal or clandestine migration. So during the early 1900s, the most common strategy that border jumpers used was to follow secret paths, footpaths, which helped them to cross the Limpopo at points that the police found difficult to control. By around 1910, when the Union of South Africa came into being, most of these secret crossings of the border had become concentrated in the triangular area, where the borders of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique intersect. This is the area that I'm talking about. So you have Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, Portuguese East Africa, which is Mozambique, and of course the Transvaal has become part of South Africa. So that area, which was very difficult to control on account of its terrain and the lack of coordination among the three countries' law enforcement agents, had become a prominent hideout for unlicensed labor recruiters, sometimes referred to as blackbirders, who often used violence and other unlawful measures in their dealings with migrants. And the area became known as Crook's Corner on account of the lawlessness that prevailed there. So the second development relates to the 1913 ban of the so-called tropical migrants in South Africa. That's the third point the second point that I want to talk about. So on 8th May 1913, South Africa's Minister for Native Affairs informed the House of Assembly that the government had decided to ban the entry of Africans from areas north of latitude 22 degrees south. If you can see, I don't know if you can see clearly on the map, this is essentially just the entire northern part, from on the northern part of not to the north of the Limpopo River, which puts the entire country of southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, into the restricted area. So the idea was that, or the argument was that, these people were dying in larger numbers than other groups that were working in South Africa, especially in the mines. Although South African government officials allowed businesses to continue employing people from the restricted areas who entered the country in contravention of the ban, the Southern Rhodesian authorities took this as an opportunity to implement more stringent measures to restrict cross-Limpopo mobilities. And this scenario created incentives for border jumping to thrive as migrants workers worked in collusion with licensed and unlicensed recruiters who helped them to evade measures that Southern Rhodesian authorities put in place in an attempt to stop labor migration to South Africa. So after the construction of the bridge across the Limpopo River, and that bridge is where the port of entry, the Bird Bridge port of entry is located today. It became common for border jumpers to pay drivers and private vehicles, drivers of private vehicles and goods trains who smuggled them across the border. And in a move that helped to encourage this practice to continue, South African authorities spurned Southern Rhodesia's efforts to organize a regional migration control mechanism during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, owing to pressure from the Transvaal Chamber of Mines, which insisted that there should be free movement of labor in the region. And the third, so you can see, as a result of those restrictions, people continued, to go to South Africa using, clandestine routes, and that avoided the border restriction measures that the Southern Rhodesian government put in place. So the third development relates to the militarization of the anti-apartheid struggle, which forced South Africa to impose strict controls of movements across its northern borders. So South Africa changed its approach to border controls in the 1960s when it took the leading role in restricting migrations from southern Rhodesia to other countries to the north. The shift came at a time of rising unemployment among the Black population in South Africa, which also coincided with the end of colonial rule in some of the countries that had been major suppliers of migrant labor to South Africa, for example, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Malawi, and Zambia. There was also an increased militarization of anti-colonial struggles in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And with the political tension rising in the region, the decision to clamp down on border jumping across the Limpopo boundary was also motivated by the desire to stop the Mkondo Sizwe fighters from coming back into the country after military training abroad. So in respect of this, or in this respect, the South African and Southern Rhodesian governments worked together in managing the border from the mid-1960s to the late 1970s. With the coming of independence in Zimbabwe in 1980, tension between the two countries re-emerged, leading to the construction of an electrified fence on the South African side of the border. This was also at the height of the civil war in Mozambique. So the fence was extended to cover the border with Mozambique. So in what appears to be acts of defiance, though, border jumpers responded by digging holes under the fence, throwing blankets and other non-conductive materials over the fence and climbed over it, with the more cunning ones actually using wire cutters to create holes in the fence. As you can see, some of these crossing points, basically they just destroyed the fence. So the final moment that I want to talk about relates to the stringent visa conditions of the post-apartheid government. So when apartheid rule came to an end in 1994, relations between Zimbabwe and South Africa greatly improved, but the South African government kept a stringent visa regime, which made it difficult for Zimbabweans to travel back and forth across the border. It was also common for border jumpers, in other words, but this did not stop border jumping. In actual fact, it created even more incentives for people to seek other alternatives of crossing into South Africa. And in this case, it was also common for border jumpers to utilize the services of informal transport operators, locally referred to as malaichas or omalaicha, and human smugglers called the magumaguma, who removed portions of the South Africa's border fence and charged fees for the use of alternative gates that they created. You can see, this is become a very prominent illegal crossing point, and these are some of the transport means that were used to, basically, move smuggled goods across the Limpopo, which you can see in the background. Now, as I conclude my presentation, I would like to highlight some of the ideas that I developed in my book and other works that I've done in this region. So from the research that I've carried so far, I learned that making a distinction between factors that push people from one country to another and those that force or encourage migrants to cross borders without following official channels would probably help us to better understand the connection between border jumping and the politics of migration control. While it makes sense, for example, to argue that the economic recession that Zimbabwe has grappled with since the late 1990s compelled many citizens of that country to move to South Africa, I argue that the recession did not cause migrants to use unofficial channels in crossing the border between these two countries. In fact, most of the people whose experiences I discuss in my book revealed that they only resorted to border jumping after being denied or having found it difficult to obtain the permits that would have allowed them to use official channels. The problem I also find with the argument that the government of post-apartheid South Africa has failed to secure the country's borders is the inherent assumption that tightening border controls helps to eradicate illegal migration. I just don't think that this is true. In fact, my research shows that rather than eliminating border jumping, and this we also saw this with the COVID-19 related restrictions. Previous attempts to restrict mobility across the Zimbabwe-South Africa border actually encouraged the use of fraudulent documents and other unofficial channels. Then there's, of course, the impression that that has been created that illegal migration between these two countries is a recent development that has no history beyond the ongoing economic crisis in Zimbabwe. There's a lot of evidence actually in the Zimbabwean and South African archives showing that the two countries have struggled with illegalized mobilities across the Limpopo since the colonial occupation of the Zimbabwean Plateau in 1890, and I just showed you some of the evidence. Furthermore, I also see border jumping from Zimbabwe to South Africa as a reflection of trends in other regions in the world where a country with a struggling economy shares a border with a more developed country. However, I think that to view this practice as simply a product of poverty, unemployment, and other conditions of insecurity in countries of migrants' origins is too simplistic. Last but not least, rather than viewing border jumpers simply as lawbreakers, which they are in most cases, I think that this most recent development that we have seen in December and January should help us to seek to understand the historical and structural conditions that make it difficult for people to follow official channels when traveling from one country to another. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. As we had mentioned before, for people who are coming in, we're saving all questions until the end. And now we will turn to our last speaker, Matthew Flom. He is from the University of Florida. And today he's going to be talking about immobilization among the mobile, coerced sedentarization of pastoralists through securitization, pandemic, and post-colonial policies. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to hear from the previous lectures. I think they're really great. So the first two lectures, I think, really focused on the health aspects and medical anthropology, and the third one was history. And as a geography student, I'm talking a bit more about spatial patterns. And I slightly changed my topic in a very academic way because I realized I'm not a historian and I can't really compare the kind of big shocks that have happened to pastoralist livelihoods. And also because there's just not a lot of data yet on the full impact of COVID on pastoralism. So instead, I'm just kind of looking at more theoretical or potential impacts that COVID would have. And there just hasn't been a lot of data collected. I really only found one report that even kind of measured any of the data through surveys. But this is not what I normally study, but I do have a public health background and did work in that at some point. So I thought it was interesting to look at that, but I normally study violence in pastoralism. So I've kind of, for this project, kind of looked at the political and other impacts of a pandemic on pastoralist livelihoods. So basically this presentation is going to talk about the current state of pastoralism in the Sahel and its interaction with COVID. Pastoralists are heavily influenced by COVID and the counter responses therein in terms of mobility, economic activities, value chain, and violence. I think a lot of groups were very affected, including farmers and migrants and refugees and other groups, but pastoralists, because they're extremely mobile, a lot of them are, then I think they're kind of extremely vulnerable in that way. And then kind of look at the policy implications to try to facilitate them maintaining their livelihoods while, respecting the health conditions so that not to make COVID worse. So just before I start, just the caveat that, of course, I'm talking about pastoralism, but they're hugely heterogeneous. So this is not a homogeneous group. They're not unified. It's not monolithic. But generally speaking, when we talk about pastoralists, it seems that most people in the world don't know who I'm talking about, or they think I'm talking about people in a church. But pastoralists, probably some people are familiar. There's a close associated with livestock, herding, and mobility, again, with very differing levels. And there's a huge spectrum of those features, particularly that considering that a lot of pastoralists are shifting into agropastoralism. So we have a spectrum of human-livestock relationship, again, the kind of fundamental feature of pastoralists. And for that, we have a couple theories like the Sahelian space as inherently insecure, meaning that all groups who live there, not just pastoralists, have to kind of reconcile that with their livelihoods in terms of being flexible, adaptable, mobile, these type of things. So there's a kind of inherent vulnerability to the livelihoods in the Sahel because of climatic conditions, because of aridity, because of things like this. So there's resource scarcity, and just not to bring up too controversial topics, but there was kind of for a long time this European belief in the unidirectional evolution of society, which kind of may exist to some degree now with a lot of the state attitudes towards pastoralists. There's often severe favoritism to industrial land development, to farming, agriculture, to foreign direct investment. So there's been a lot of neglect and even outright hostility towards pastoralists, in that considering that they're maybe backwards or not compatible with modern states. So again, it's not my opinion, but did account for a lot of attitudes historically to these type of groups. So in terms of livelihoods of pastoralists, some of the theories, I don't have time to get into these in any great detail, but there's a lot of mobility theories and adaptation theories. So mobile space theory is one I use a lot in my own research for my PhD, but that involves features like circulation and production and how pastoralists navigate the insecure terrain of the Sahel. So I mentioned I kind of changed my topic. What I had really wanted to do is compare like different kind of regimes to pastoralist livelihoods, colonial, post-colonial, and then pandemic, not just COVID, but also some of the other things like Ebola or different pandemics. Again, I'm not a historian. I don't really have a lot of data on COVID yet, but there just it's important to note that there have been a lot of disruptions to pastoralist livelihoods. People know about this. This is in the news, but the colonial period had a lot of shifts in terms of kind of taking away a lot of the power and wealth that a lot of pastoralists had developed through trade routes, particularly Tuareg and Fulani. And then some other ones are the post-colonial governments, where, again, I mentioned before, a lot of problematic land codes and pastoral codes that are not well enforced, that are not well funded. So there's just been a lot of marginalization of these groups. And then there are ones that I think are kind of at a low chronic level throughout, environmental change, violence. So I study violence and pastoralism. So these are other kind of shocks that happen to pastoralists. So why should we study and care about pastoralists? Pretty significant population, the largest both numerical and proportion in the entire world. It's found in West Africa and the Sahel. So there's a lot of cultural diversity. Economic importance is about 44% of the agricultural GDP relates to pastoralism. That's almost $1 billion a year. 50% of population in this region owns livestock. And there's a large amount of livestock in this region with cattle and ruminants and poultry. It's one of the principal economic activities for families and the poor. Again, you would see this throughout much of Africa, that a lot of the employment is in this informal agricultural sector. And for my own research, I do insecurity and violence. I have a forthcoming report and found that about 20% of violent events and a slightly higher percentage of fatalities did involve pastoralists in this region. So they're important for security and peace, which is widely reported in a lot of these reports and scholarship. So COVID in West Africa, again, this is not focused too much on the health implications. Some of the other presenters, I think, did a good job of talking about the context, but entire West Africa estimates about 427,000 cases, 6,000 deaths. That represents, again, these numbers could be underreported because of testing limitations, but that represents about 13% of the African burden. But this population in West Africa is more like 30 to 35%. So it's kind of, West Africa has done pretty well. Again, given the numbers that we have and what we know about it, it could be much higher, but some of the lowest death rates in the world and some of the lowest infection rates in the world. The major countries, though, that have had significant burden are Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire. Just for comparison, it's a fairly similar population of West Africa, probably approaching 300 million, US 350 million. US had 30 million cases and 500,000 deaths. So you can see West Africa's much lower burden, but not to say it's not important and serious. There's a lot of economic impacts, and then there's, of course, a huge healthcare burden in rural areas because of testing limits, because of lack of government investment in infrastructure. So some of the COVID responses, again, this is not the focus here, but most of the countries throughout all the continent, as far as I'm aware, did border and travel restrictions meaning international flight bans, school closures, and bans on large gatherings. beyond those major restrictions that all countries implemented, West Africa countries enacted a mix of social distancing and movement restrictions. This is from the Dutch Klingendale Institute report last year. So some countries did various other things like curfews, lockdowns, and other measures, but these were usually sporadic and not, like chronically enforced, but rather doing when there was maybe high transmission or certain other factors. Some of the complications were that there was often subnational, local, communal restrictions and closures, like market closure, quarantines, curfews, social distancing, which were done at certain subnational levels, so they weren't really done universally throughout countries. So just to kind of situate the framework a bit, what we have is pastoralist livelihoods. Again, this is a gross generalization because there's huge amount of heterogeneity for pastoralists, but their livelihoods do involve some level of herding, grazing, migrations, trade, value chains. Again, some of the knock-on effects in terms of yogurt and milk and hides and big market trading of these goods. The requirements for this often involve mobility, quality pasture, open markets so they can exchange and sell them, buy and sell. Border crossing, again, this is not inherent for all pastoralists. So there are some groups like Nigerian Tuaregs who often migrate within nationally in Niger, but don't necessarily cross borders, versus Fulani who are living in 21 countries, in Africa, would be crossing borders quite a lot more. Tuareg also cross borders because of their ancestral territory. And then some adaptability and mobility, again, really depending on climatic conditions and some other things. Okay, so on the other side, we have the COVID pandemic. Associated with this, we have, this is not a health talk, but transmission, healthcare burden, neglect of rural areas, morbidity, mortality concerns, maybe some others. And then some of the restrictions are going to be market closure, border closure, restriction of movement, restriction of trade and gathering, which is really important for pastoralists, and curfews. And so you kind of have this interaction where you have some of these restrictions impinging on some of the requirements for pastoralists. And those are kind of what I want to look at theoretically in this talk, especially mobility, the markets, and adaptability. So for transhumant corridors, transhumant being the form of mobility that a lot of pastoralists have, we have three major axes: the Western Basin, Central Basin, Eastern Market. I will show you a map. It's very intuitive because there's often in a maps presented the strip of the pastoral zone, and these three axes kind of form that zone. And they involve different countries and different migrations and trading routes. So so one other question I thought I'd start to address in this and maybe get some more data, if possible, is to look at like which of these would be most affected by COVID restrictions. So this is a famous map. You'll see it in all sorts of reports. The OECD published it, I think maybe 2014 or some year. So it looks really complicated, but a big thing would be to look at the lighter green and the darker blue lines. So one of those is national transhumance. So that's what I was talking about in Niger with the Tuaregs, for example, where you see that they migrate often within Niger, versus the darker lines are more cross-border transhumance. So those are groups and routes that would involve some kind of border, crossing of borders. So these three axes, you have the Western, Central, and the Eastern, and I'll talk a bit about maybe which ones would be most affected. This is just to show you some of the livelihoods for pastoralists. Again, it's really hard to generalize because there's so much diversity, but often there's a north to south migration during a dry season. Why? Because the southern regions would have more rainfall and appropriate pasture, and then going back to the north. But again, it's a huge generalization, and there's a lot of different forms, but a lot of them are quite cyclical. So they go somewhere during part of the season and return after that season is finished. These are kind of the measures in the countries that I was able to find. You see there's a lot of similarity. So all of them suspended international flights, borders closed in all except Guinea, mandatory masks, all of them limited gatherings. And certain countries did a lot of domestic travel restrictions like Guinea, Senegal, and Benin, but highly dynamic and variable. So it did shift over time. And again, it shifted spatially within each country. This map is pretty useless because all it shows you is all the countries close their borders. The color theme is just to show different groups of countries, but the red line is what's important. All the countries had border closures. So this is one of the only data sources I was able to find. There's nothing in English, so it's only in French through different organizations. This is Action contre la faim, so Action Against Hunger, and had some really interesting data taken at relay points. So these like cross-border points or different points where pastoralists interact with authorities, and had a couple different measures which can start to help tell us what's going on. This is reduction in movement that was mentioned at the relays, and just they extracted from these points, these blue dots, to get kind of a sample for that entire country. Seeing that there's a big range, that countries like Togo had, I believe Togo was like 98% of people mentioned that there was a reduction in movement because of delays and other restrictions, versus Mali was a bit less, I think like 48%, but a big range throughout this region, but most of them above 45%, ranging from 45 to about 98%. So showing that there's some impact of COVID on their mobility. I'm still working on this data. Well, I'm not working, I'm trying to find if it exists. But you see that I would really like to show which of these corridors is most affected, because that could really inform policy and tell us kind of get us more clarification on what's going on. The countries with border closures, not that important because there's 100% in all the regions. I'm still trying to find if there's data on accurate number of transnational crossings, because that could tell us, you know, some severity of impact on pastoralists given on how many of the crossings are closed. And then trying to find, I think it would be interesting to know the percentage of delays and restrictions that pastoralists are encountering in each of these corridors for comparison, to see if maybe one of the corridors is more adversely affected. So this is a really cool data source where they're showing market activity for livestock in the region, and they have a daily figure that you can load. The day I did this was Thursday, so I believe it was the 14th. And actually that particular day, the market activity was like 97%, meaning that like everything was basically status quo. I mean, everyone was supposedly able to like do their business in terms of market. And so the dots here are animal concentrations. And again, just for importance of borders, it's really important for pastoralism. You just see that a lot of these are clustered around borders and concentrated on borders, particularly Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Also Senegal, Mauritania is another really important one. But you see that fortunately there's not too high concentration of animals, because that may seem good, but that can be bad because it means, you know, there's some restriction or some problem in exchange. So again, the quarantine situation I mentioned is usually subnational, and there's some conflicting data, but one thing is that none of the countries closed over 50% of the total market. So if you take the national list of all the markets, none of them were above 50%. However, there's a lot of spatial clustering, and market closures were often localized. So in certain regions of, especially Burkina Faso, Chad, Senegal, Nigeria, and Guinea, you had some regions closing 60 to 100%. I saw a couple anecdotal cases of regions closing 100% of their markets, which would be really problematic. You know, this is not what the focus of this talk is about, but the spatial movement of goods in the Sahel often goes from rural production zones, particularly for livestock, to other rural zones and to urban consumption zones where they have, you know, big markets and a demand for a lot of livestock. So this is Burkina Faso. This was April last year. So the problem with a lot of this data is, you know, it's not consistent. There's not a lot of continuity, but you see that, well, the red border around shows that the country closes borders, and internally, you see that some of these shaded ones with red is where they had quarantine in these subnational communes or district or village. So it's not universal, but again, you know, spatially, it would be, I need to, I guess, find, you know, where pastoralist activity is very active in Burkina Faso and try to coordinate it with these closures and quarantines to see if that would affect them. So this is not a talk about agriculture, but there was, most of the research I found was on agricultural value chains, maybe because it's considered more financially important or more significant for the region. But there was quite a few reports on the impacts on agricultural value chains, moving from rural to urban areas, transportation issues, closed markets, rising food prices. combined with decrease in availability of food, which is not a good combination. Loss of livelihoods, of course, increased reliance on social safety nets, with the caveat that there weren't a lot of safety nets in some of these poorer countries. A lot of this work is agricultural and formal, so it means people are extremely vulnerable, right? They don't have pensions or work contracts. They're doing this at very informal level, at family scale or small community scale. Loss of work from COVID is obviously affecting many workers, and that's true around the world, but especially in these type of countries. So just to point this out, not to make anyone feel bad, but these people are not privileged like us. They don't have the ability to telecommute, work from home, really adapt in a meaningful way because they're doing farming and livestock work. That doesn't really translate into digital or virtual work. So it's not a lot of options they have. So there's been some evidence of the negative impact on agricultural value chains, but the question is, what about pastoralists and herding? So livestock also has their own value chains. I'm not really going to get into this, but you have knock-on effects: butchers and restaurants, wholesalers.
Matthew,
yeah.
Can you wrap this up because
yes.
we're running over?
Oh, sorry. Can I get like 1 more minute?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So I'll skip this. So this is a table I was trying to work on. Again, the Action contre la Faim survey, which had some really good data, but it's not very complete. So try to find some other sources. But look at the countries I study in Central Sahel mostly, seeing that there's been some evidence of decreased mobility at the relay stations and also decline in livestock feed. So that's bad because the livestock will get sick and will die, will have malnutrition. A lot of countries already have a pretty significant ban on transhumance. The exceptions I found were like Chad and Togo. I study violence, so it's interesting that the same report was talking about the evolution in the presence of tensions at the water points in the countries of interest, and just showing that this wasn't, they had a few anecdotal cases of outright violence, but more just that there was more tensions between ethnic groups and between different groups because of delays and because of different competition over resources and stuff like that. So just potential increase in violence that is already existing in a lot of the region. So I think where would the COVID disrupt the most is probably rural areas where these people have a few savings or surpluses, along some of these corridors that are most affected by the border closures. I think some of the long-term ramifications, there's a lot, but some of the evidence suggests 23 million West Africans are going to be face poverty and impoverishment from COVID and other economic things. There's been some authoritarian issues, economic growth contraction at a huge degree, ranging from -5% to 2%. And then COVID triggered rise in food prices and decline, loss in livelihoods. And then we should always remember the most vulnerable groups like women, children, migrants, rural farmers, pastoralists, and refugees. So I got some of these recommendations from that ACF report, but like I think some of the policy implications are like improve access to health facilities in rural areas. The regional and national policymakers need to coordinate interventions, and then cross-border livestock flows really need to be facilitated. So that's all I have. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers. So we have a list of questions already that people would like to ask in our chat. Let's see, we have 2 questions. I'm trying to see if folks are still here. I think Beth Whitaker is here and she has a question for Francis. Would you like to go ahead?
I could, but I know that Chineku had a question for the first speaker. And
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. There you are. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, maybe should I go ahead?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. We tried. So Francis, thank you for these were all really interesting presentations, first of all. And Francis, thanks a lot for providing that historical context. I have already put your book in my Amazon cart. So but I wanted to ask 2 quick questions. One, I'm fascinated with this. You called it the ban on tropical migrants. This 22nd degree latitude, and I'm like fascinated read about that. I hadn't known about that, and sort of how was it justified? You know, it seems pretty clear that it's targeting Southern Rhodesia, but then obviously that means that, you know, within Botswana, there's a line in the middle. And did they actually enforce it for people? I mean, I'm just fascinated sort of how it was justified, and was it actually applied, or was it only applied to keep people out from Southern Rhodesia? So I would love to hear a little bit more about that. And then the other thing that you sort of got to, or you mentioned a little or sort of touched on, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of what I consider to be a false distinction between refugees and migrants, that there's, you know, a lot of times people leave their homes for multiple reasons, which can include politics and economics, right? And politics shape economics and economics shape politics and things like that. And I feel like Zimbabwe over many years sort of illustrates that, right? This effort by countries within the region to categorize Zimbabweans on the move as migrants, when sometimes you could actually see them as refugees, and it just that false distinction, I think, is perhaps part of what's at play in some of the policies in the region. So I'll stop there.
Okay, should I go ahead and respond? Okay, thank you so much. You know, very, very good questions. I will try to be brief. Yes, I'll start with your second question. The first distinction between refugees and migrants. Of course, you would understand that this is a decision that is made by a country that is receiving the people who are on the move, and most of these distinctions are policy decisions are made in light of what the country sees itself as its obligations. If you acknowledge that these are refugees, what are you going to do about that? What does that mean? Not just in terms of people who are coming, but also what is happening in that country where they are coming from. And this is a question that South Africa has had to struggle with, post-apartheid, but also even during the apartheid era in the 1980s, 70s and 80s with the Mozambican civil war. South Africa at that time did not have a properly designed refugee policy to work with. And as a result, most of the people who were running away from the Mozambican civil war, and to some extent even from the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, had to cross into South Africa and self-settle without any help from the South African apartheid government. And of course, these people were making use of the relational contacts that they had. Mostly people from the border regions would have relatives across the border. So yes, it's a policy decision that is made of course, in light of the responsibilities and the obligations that a country sees itself as having towards the crisis in question. And about the 22 degrees latitude, well, yes, there was, this to some extent, there was a political debate in the South African parliament for almost 3 years, from 1910 to 1913. And the Labour Party, which was the opposition party, was pushing for the restriction of people, entry of people from north of latitude 22 degrees south on account of statistics that they had received. And some of these statistics were reported in the newspapers, and of course by the mines, where which showed that these people coming from above latitude 22 degrees south were dying in larger numbers than other people, locals and people from the south. And this is where the idea of the tropical migrant is coming from. I have actually seen statistics from that era, coming from these mines, and you would see that yes, the numbers were different. Was it because of just the attention being focused on these groups of people, as opposed to other people? I don't know, but statistics will show you that there was that disparity. But then you would also want to see that for the Labour Party, which was the opposition party, the idea was also to restrict the movement, the in-migration of foreigners who would obviously cause the salaries in these mining ventures to be low for the local people, because the idea was to stop the people coming from the north, so that stop migrants, so that the local people could actually make use of these opportunities. And so there was that. But for the mining companies, it was also, they worked very much, they were not happy with the ban, and they worked, in collusion with the labor recruiters, and they influenced the government to not strictly enforce the ban, even when the ban was kind of enacted into law, which was, again, very much debated. So yeah, there was a lot of political, a lot of politics was involved. And at the end of the day, it did not just affect people from Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. Another country which was heavily affected is Mozambique, because the line also crosses Mozambique, and leaving the northern part of Mozambique as restricted. And you have a lot of people first moving into the southern part of Mozambique and claim to be coming from there in order to be accepted into the in the mining regions in South Africa. So yeah, there's a lot of politics, but the statistics also show that there was a disparity in terms of death rates. Thank you.
Thank you. We would like to call on Chineko next.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Great.
Okay, I am sorry about that. So I'm going to be quick. I know that Amson was asking for feedback a little bit, and I did appreciate his presentation. My question has to do with the whole idea of waiting and the voice, or who's writing, are you writing on behalf of the African people? Who's really waiting? Is it the world waiting or the African people waiting? Because really, I know that many of them are not waiting for the vaccine, right? And the other question is, should they be waiting? Really, should it really be framed in this manner? Because at the end of the day, the whole idea of waiting on the West for vaccines, doesn't it extend that whole idea of dependency and so on? So I think really we should go back to this whole idea of the biomedical versus the traditional, because throughout the whole period of this COVID situation in Africa, traditional and indigenous remedies and therapies that have been produced have been dismissed by the West. So why do we have to now say we are waiting on them? I have a little issue with that.
Yeah, thank you. Thinking about waiting is definitely something I've been interested in. It is not as a sort of blanket description for the ways in which people sort of pass, not necessarily just pass time, but sort of exist through life, is something that is I've thought about and think about it in terms of broader sort of neoliberal and like global capitalist frameworks. Waiting, I've sort of picked up from my work with unauthorized migrants in Niger, has been something that people themselves have told me they're doing. And it's sort of whether that's waiting for word from the consulate that they will be able to travel without papers, or waiting for a job despite trying again and again and again, sort of waiting for a callback, or waiting for the chance to sort of move clandestinely. I thought about that, and I've had issues trying to like put these two things together for this short paper about my experiences sort of hanging around unauthorized migrants, mostly Liberians in Niger, and this notion of sort of African waithood. And there are definitely, you're right, there are definitely a lot of people throughout the continent who are not necessarily waiting for a vaccine. There are other moments and other sort of things or phenomenon that people wait for, and that's not particularly that is not particular to Africa. Let's put it that way, right? And the capitalist constraints that sort of force down or apply a downward pressure to all people, especially everyone in the global south, there is aspects of waiting for governmental relief, or the idea of the government being able to sort of institute sort of measures to take care of their citizens. There are all these sorts of waiting that takes place, but the idea that waiting is a static sort of phenomenon or activity is false. And if that came across when I mentioned waiting, I want to sort of disabuse people of that notion. Their waiting is a particular activity, and it's not one that forecloses the ability for people to engage in other stuff. No one's necessarily like waiting sort of in their room for things to happen, but waiting for a particular temporality or horizon to sort of arrive while doing other things. So I know the vaccine thing, and that is a good point to mention that, again, sort of remedies or other traditional or other, let's say, like other medicines and capacities that are sort of alternative to Western biomedicine have been sort of eschewed by the West. I mean, there is definitely a lot to that. And so it may have come across that I meant that like all of Africa is waiting for this, but in addition to doing other things, there has been a sort of queue for the vaccine, especially for those who wanted it. And so speaking to those, speaking from the perspective of those folks and folks I've talked to, there are individuals who are definitely upset that they had been sort of made to be in line, but not to say that people are waiting for all sorts of things, if that makes sense. Does that answer? Does that address your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. So our next question is going to be coming from Seth Palmer.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi. Thanks for these great series of talks, and following up on that last question, it's just been so provocative as I'm sitting here thinking through my own material, as someone who's also writing about traditional medicines and the kind of tensions that's coming out in all of this. And Amson, your paper made me think about, the literature and anthropology on waithood, and especially because you're, I guess, thinking about this in a Nigerian context about Ellen Mescali's work. And then Kristen just kind of touched on that in terms of social adulthood. So I really love that. And I also was thinking, Amson, like maybe there's ways that you could bring in the way that Kirsten was kind of pushing back against that work in terms of creativity and agency. And I think that was already there in your talk. And maybe that's a way that you can kind of push back or complicate some of these ideas about waiting and waithood. That's it. I'll just leave it there. But thanks so much, everyone. These are great papers.
No, it's definitely a good point. And as I sort of rereading this paper, it's sort of like, wow, there's almost, I can understand why one would listen to what I had to say and realize, well, do Africans do anything, or are they just sitting there waiting for gifts? And that's not the case. And I think that's definitely, to your point, Seth, and also Chiniku's point, whether one is like waiting for one thing, that person or those people are also doing other things, right? To sort of mitigate the sort of maybe distance horizon for that other thing they're waiting for. So in order to like live in the now, one cannot wait exclusively for the future. So yeah, that's there's definitely something to speak about. And I've tried and sort of like thinking about how to rework this paper and extend it. I'm focusing on what individual countries have been doing, again, whether it's like South Africa or Kenya recently, or in Niger, which yesterday Niger just opened up its the Grand Marché, the big market in Niamey, to like reopen, for commerce again. And there has been a lot of work that has gone in the past couple months to like make that reality possible. And so speaking about those particular activities that have, been in the works for months since early 2020, I think that's pretty useful. So like African governments and peoples themselves have been doing stuff. They've also endured a lot. And Kristen mentioned some of this too, with people sort of being, with these curfews and like sort of mandates to like not go out, closing the markets, which for many people in major cities, but also in like smaller areas, that those are like the places where people sort of engage with the world, is in a market or in these moments of commerce / conviviality. And so how people have endured those particular restraints, but also moved around to still perpetuate and foster, solidarity and community with people in the midst of lockdown. Those are pretty interesting. So it's this is not necessarily just about vaccines, although that was the thing that immediately grabbed me. But there are ways that there are stories around the vaccines and sort of waiting for vaccines that are also really interesting. And you're right, I'd like to bring that stuff in too.
Can I just comment on the back of that? I actually was wondering if I don't know if this came up in the workshop yesterday, but if you considered about thinking about waiting in the context of the COVID vaccine, like in comparative perspective. I'm thinking of like the HIV/AIDS, like the like waiting for our ARVs, right? And you could think about the dynamism, the agency of individual like advocacy groups like TAC and those who advocated for access to ARVs. And of course, we haven't really seen how that's going to play out in the context of COVID, but it might be an interesting sort of comparative perspective. I think the individual element in terms of the impact on individual lives is also super interesting, and the two are in conversation with one another. But I also think this, it will be interesting to see how groups advocate in response to sort of this global health regime in comparison to how they've done so in the past.
That's a good point. With HIV and definitely in relation to COVID-19, which we've seen over the past year, there's in the late 80s, 90s, throughout the early 2000s, like HIV, the risk, the perceived risk or the perception of risk for public health folks out there was much higher for HIV and AIDS than it has been for COVID-19. And so the palpable fear and consternation sort of circulating around the idea of HIV, and then also there's definitely sort of there has been a latent sort of attendant homophobia that sort of trafficked along with it. Those have been sort of greater than what at least I've experienced with COVID-19. And so that's something that's really interesting. And it's possible maybe a part of the reason why folks are maybe less eager for a vaccine or those sorts of things in relation to what we've seen with HIV. And this thing I tried to bring in we've seen this before in terms of like using, all of Africa as like a laboratory for testing with the polio vaccination of 1957 in the Belgian Congo. And as a historical sort of arc for, again, using Africa as a colonial laboratory. And I think, Kristen, what you mentioned about HIV is actually pretty interesting. And again, sort of regional and global sort of fears around a particular infection or disease. I think that's really interesting. And off the top of my head, it doesn't look like COVID is, at least right now, going to occupy that same sort of level of fear and space in people's minds. But I like that.
Thank you. The next person that I have is Sydney. Sydney, still here?
Yes. Hello. So Professor McLean can attest, I've been very interested in the vaccine distribution in Africa. But when you were talking about, this is for Amson, the hesitancy of Africans, the idea of them being a lab for Western countries, do you think that hesitancy is directly related to that? Or like if, say, we're seeing Eastern countries like China donating vaccines to Sierra Leone, for instance, do you think that hesitancy would be different from Eastern vaccines versus Western?
That's a good question, Eileen. I do not think so, but that's just me. That might be a personal reflection on these particular events. Yesterday, Kenya just received its like largest shipment, or sorry, last week, a couple days ago, Kenya received a really large shipment from part of COVAX, that WHO platform, and it was manufactured by an Indian pharmaceutical firm. And you know, the Kenyan government is really excited, and for people who want it, sort of like as a, whether people are interested in the vaccine or not, the availability of it is sort of there. So that provides it may provide a sense of security that may allow people to feel like, oh, I don't really need it, but like if I want it, I have the ability to get it, right? So that's there. And I don't think so. You know, that's off the top of my head. I don't necessarily think so. And there's a lot of, with TRIPS legislation, especially India winning a sort of Supreme Court case in India a couple, maybe days ago, getting sort of dispensation from like the really, you know, sort of devastating and anti-South logics of trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, and sort of allowed India and other nations, but specifically India, to reproduce vaccines using a patent, I think, from Pfizer at scale. And you know, that's part of the reason why they've been able to, you know, have this, reproduce this vaccine and sell it to places like Kenya. I don't know if if you're speaking to a possible fear about the efficacy of these drugs being maybe lower in, like, let's say Asia, or like, you know, including Russia, or versus like the West. I don't think so. And I haven't heard anything like that. So I'm not inclined to think so.
A quick follow-up question. So do you think it's like we'll see government policies trying to get people to, you know, trust in the safety of it? I know here in, you know, Tuskegee, we're seeing big social movements or efforts to, you know, show these people that are scared, rightfully so, especially in Tuskegee, about the vaccine and them being lab rats, but they're seeing, I guess, in Tuskegee, a positive effect of people going out in the community and saying, I got my vaccine, like it's fine, this is working. So do you think we'll see that in African countries, or that it'll just be, if you want it, take it?
I don't think so, particularly because a lot of governments and leaders for many of these countries have not necessarily been responsible historically for exposing their citizens to, you know, sort of really messed up laboratory conditions, right? And I think you sort of fixating on Tuskegee has been, especially in the US, has been definitely overblown, and for several reasons. But recently, in the past week, we finally started seeing reports in mainstream media about this sort of vaccine hesitancy around, like, from white populations, right? So like white peoples and all the demographics of white people, whether they're like Republicans, college age people, you know, the rural, like Midwestern, whatever, like the vaccine hesitancy or like vaccine refusal among white people in America, particularly white men, is actually quite high. It's always been quite high, but this idea of like fear of the government, and or sort of fear of like science and the state, has disproportionately and unfairly been placed upon Black peoples in the US. And you know, it's taken months for people to actually catch up and be like, why are the vaccine rates so low among white people? And so you know, I don't think I don't think that'll necessarily take place, or that it even has to, in places like, you know, again, Niger, or like Togo, or like Kenya. But I mean, it is taking place in places like France, where again, they've corralled and have acquired all these vaccines, but quote unquote nobody wants to take them, or like places in the US, or like in Canada. So I definitely think that this is mainly particular to like some of these Western nations.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And we have a question from Dennis, if you would like to ask your question, or if you'd rather I read it from the chat.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm just gonna voice it out. I was interested in Amson's presentation too, and I just had a quick thought that he might think about, especially on the question of waiting. I was thinking that perhaps he can also examine or explore the possibilities that some of these skepticisms that are coming, not just from the West, but I've been following the distribution and the vaccination going on in Africa, and some of them are arising from arguments that, of course, Africa has been considered second class, and so this argument has also been coming out that especially the vaccines being distributed there are considered second class. COVAX, Pfizer, from some quarters, I hear some people argue that the vaccine being distributed is not partly or largely that which is distributed, for example, in America or in Europe. And another example that he may want to follow is Germany. I was following that they have also, some citizens in Germany have not taken, especially the AstraZeneca vaccine, because they are considering it to be a second-class vaccine. And therefore, Germany is the homeland where Pfizer is located, and it's the one kind of like distributing. So they're asking themselves, why is it that they're not getting Pfizer and they're getting this COVAX vaccine? And so I was wondering if these skepticisms are part or caused by perhaps market supremacy wars amongst pharmaceutical companies in the West. And I was just thinking about how that can speak to Amson's idea of waiting and the skepticism arising.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Yeah, okay, we'll wrap up really quickly. Yeah, that I'll think about that. And that definitely sounds like some sort of, there's a brand recognition, which is not necessarily just placed on something like AstraZeneca, but also how and where it was produced. So there's like, whether it's a brand recognition with like Moderna coming from the US, that's like a double sort of brand sort of placement going on there, or the sort of quote unquote generic vaccines that are coming from like India and Russia are like something interesting to consider. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your contributions to this panel and hope you have a great rest of the meeting. All right, bye.